Winston Churchill, the indomitable leader of Great Britain, was a man who rarely showed fear. He had faced the Blitz, the fall of France, and the threat of invasion. But he later confessed in his memoirs, "The only thing that ever really frightened me during the war," he wrote, "was the U-boat peril." He wasn't afraid of the Luftwaffe. He wasn't afraid of the panzers. He was afraid of a simple, brutal equation of maritime logistics. Great Britain is an island. In 1940, every drop of fuel for its Spitfires, every shell for its anti-aircraft guns, every tank for its army, and, most critically, every loaf of bread for its people, had to cross the Atlantic Ocean by ship. If that lifeline was cut, Britain would not be invaded. It would starve. It would suffocate. And the war would be over. And in the dark, freezing waters of the North Atlantic, one man had dedicated his entire existence to cutting that lifeline. Admiral Dönitz, commander of the U-boat Waffe. Dönitz was a brilliant, ruthless strategist. He saw what others did not. He knew the U-boat's greatest strength was not its torpedoes, it was its radio. He dismissed the old idea of the lone submarine hunter. Instead, he created the Rudeltaktik, the Wolfpack. The plan was simple and devastating. A single U-boat scouting a picket line would spot an Allied convoy. It would not attack. It would surface, use its powerful radio, and call the pack. For the next 24 to 48 hours, U-boats from hundreds of miles around would converge like sharks sensing blood. Then at night, they would strike. Dönitz trained his captains to attack on the surface. A surfaced U-boat was small, fast, and almost invisible to the crude sonar called ASDIC, used by the Allied escort ships. The ASDIC King could only find a submerged submarine. The U-boats would slip inside the convoy, in the dark, surrounded by the very merchant ships they were hunting. They would fire their torpedoes at point-blank range, then dive and slip away in the chaos. For the Allied sailors, it was a nightmare. A ship in their convoy, 500 yards away, would suddenly vaporize in a flash of orange light. Then another, then a third. They were being slaughtered by an enemy they could not see from a direction they could not predict. This was the happy time. From 1940 to 1941, U-boat aces became superstars in Germany. Men like Otto Kretschmer, the tonnage king, or Gunther Prien, who snuck into the British naval base at Scapa Flow and sank a battleship. They were sinking ships with impunity. The Allied escorts, mostly small corvettes, were overwhelmed. They were too few, too slow, and their technology was a generation behind. They were always one step behind the Wolfpack. Britain was bleeding. And then the United States entered the war. The lifeline was now twice as long, but surely with the industrial might of America, the U-boats would be crushed. What happened was the exact opposite. For the U-boats, the happy time was about to get a whole lot happier. December 7th, 1941. Pearl Harbor. Germany declared war on the United States 4 days later. While America's attention was on the Pacific, Admiral Dönitz gave the order for Operation Paukenschlag, Operation Drumbeat. On January 11, 1942, the first 5 U-boats arrived off the east coast of the United States. What they found was not a nation at war. It was a shooting gallery. The U-boat commanders could not believe their eyes. The cities of the East Coast, New York, Atlantic City, Miami, refused to order a blackout. The bright lights of the cities and seaside resorts silhouetted the merchant ships perfectly. They were dark, lumbering targets against a bright background. In one of the most catastrophic failures of American naval command, Admiral Ernst King, the U.S. Chief of Naval Operations, refused to implement a convoy system. He was an old-school battleship admiral. He considered convoys defensive and un-American. He wanted his destroyers to hunt, not babysit. Dönitz unleashed hell. For the next 6 months, the second happy time made the first one look like a training exercise. U-boats sat on the seabed during the day, listening to American radio, then surfaced at night and torpedoed ships within sight of the shore. Civilians in Florida would stand on their balconies and watch tankers explode. The beaches from North Carolina to Florida were black with oil and littered with the bodies of sailors. The U-boats were sinking ships so fast they literally ran out of torpedoes. They would surface and sink ships with their deck guns. In just 6 months, Operation Drumbeat sank over 600 ships. It was the most lopsided naval victory of the entire war. This was the tonnage war. And by mid-1942, when the Allies finally forced a convoy system, the data was terrifying. Churchill and Roosevelt would review a chart every week. This chart showed 2 lines. One line was Allied shipping tonnage sunk. The other line was Allied shipping tonnage built. In 1942, the sunk line was horrifically higher than the built line. It didn't matter how many tanks or planes America was building. It didn't matter how brave the British were. The Allies were losing the Battle of the Atlantic. They were running out of ships. They were running out of time. They had to find a way to fight back. The solution, when it came, was not a bigger gun or a faster ship. It was a secret. The tide of the Battle of the Atlantic turned, not in a single day, but in a series of quiet, hidden breakthroughs. It wasn't one secret, it was 3, all converging at the same time. At a secret country estate north of London called Bletchley Park, a team of brilliant, eccentric minds led by the genius Alan Turing was fighting a silent war. Their target was the German Enigma machine, the unbreakable cipher device that Dönitz used to communicate with his U-boats. In 1941, a daring British naval raid captured an Enigma machine and its codebooks from a sinking U-boat, U-1010. This was the pinch. For the first time, Bletchley Park could read Dönitz's mind. The ultra-intelligence was a game-changer. Allied commanders could now see the U-boat patrol lines. They knew where the Wolfpacks were gathering before the attack. They could reroute their convoys around the ambushes. The U-boat captains were baffled. They would lie in wait in a perfect ambush position, only to see the convoys mysteriously divert, passing just outside their range of sight. They were hunting ghosts. But Enigma wasn't enough. The codebreakers at Bletchley Park were brilliant, but the German Navy changed the codes frequently. Sometimes the Allies would be blind for weeks at a time. They couldn't just avoid the U-boats, they had to kill them. To do that, they needed a second secret, technology. The U-boat's greatest advantage was the night. Surfaced, it was a tiny sliver of steel, invisible in the dark. This is when it siphoned air into its cabins and, most importantly, recharged its electric batteries for diving. Then, British scientists invented centimetric radar. Before this, radar sets were huge, clumsy, and used long wavelengths that U-boats could easily detect. But this new 10-centimeter radar was small enough to fit on an airplane, and its wavelength was too short for German detectors to pick up. The first planes equipped with it were Vickers Wellington bombers, painted black, flying out of England. Imagine you were a U-boat commander. It's 2 a.m., pitch black, 500 miles from land. You're on the surface, charging your batteries. The air is fresh. Suddenly, out of the total darkness, a searchlight, called a lee light, snaps on, illuminating your sub like a stage. At the same time, the sky erupts with 20-millimeter cannon fire. A bomber, which you never saw, never heard, has used its secret radar to home in on you. Before you can even shout alarm to dive, depth charges are bracketing your submarine. The night was no longer safe. The hunters had become the hunted. Dönitz's Wolfpack tactic, his greatest strength, was also his greatest weakness. It relied on radio. The U-boats had to constantly transmit short messages to report convoy sightings and coordinate attacks. The Allies developed a technology called high-frequency direction finding, or HFDUF. A HFDUF set on an escort ship could pick up a U-boat's short radio burst. Within seconds, it could give the ship's captain a precise bearing, a direction, to that U-boat. Now, the Wolfpack's call was a death sentence. A U-boat surfaces. Convoy sighted, grid square 43. Radio static. On the British destroyer, a light flashes in the radio room. The captain is on the intercom. Bearing 270, 8 miles, hard to starboard, full ahead. The escort ship would race down the bearing, its own radar lighting up the U-boat. The U-boat, stunned, would be forced to dive, its attack broken. By 1943, the Allies had the secrets. They could read the U-boat's mail, see them in the dark, and hear their whispers. Now they just needed to solve one last logistical problem. The North Atlantic is a vast, empty, violent place. The critical battles were fought in an area known as the Mid-Atlantic Gap, or the Black Pit. This was a 600-mile-wide patch of ocean in the dead center of the Atlantic. It was too far for bombers flying from England or Canada to reach. Inside this gap, there was no air cover. For 3 or 4 days, the convoys were alone. This was the U-boat's last best hunting ground. They would wait here, knowing the Allied planes couldn't touch them. The Allies had to close that gap. They did it with 2 industrial-strength solutions. The first was the very long-range B-24 Liberator. This was a heavy bomber, stripped of its armor and bombs, and filled with one thing: fuel. These new B-24s could fly for 18 hours. They could patrol the Black Pit from bases in Iceland and Newfoundland. When they arrived, equipped with the new centimetric radar, they were a terrifying new predator. A U-boat surfaced in the gap now had to contend with a 4-engine bomber diving from the clouds. But the B-24s were few. The real solution was even more audacious. If you can't fly planes to the middle of the ocean, why not have them sail there? The Allies needed aircraft carriers. But fleet carriers, like the USS Enterprise, were priceless assets, desperately needed in the Pacific. The solution came from Henry J. Kaiser, the same man who was mass-producing Liberty cargo ships. Kaiser's philosophy was not quality, it was quantity. He proposed building small, cheap escort carriers. These jeep carriers, or baby flat tops, were built on simple merchant ship hulls. They were slow, unarmored, and carried only 20 or 30 planes.
but they were expendable, and they could be built fast. Kaiser's shipyards were churning them out in just 3 months. Now, a convoy didn't have to hope for air cover. It brought its own. The U-boat commander, surfacing for an attack, would suddenly see a flight of Grumman Wildcat fighters diving on him 800 miles from the nearest land. The Black Pit was closed. By April 1943, all the pieces were in place. The Enigma codes were being read, the ships and planes had radar, the escorts had Huff-Duff, the convoys had their own air cover. Dönitz, unaware that his every move was being tracked and his every technology was countered, sensed the convoys were getting tougher. He believed the solution was one final massive offensive. He ordered all his U-boats into the North Atlantic to create a super Wolfpack. The trap was set, but it was not for the Allies. It was for him.
May 1943. This was the climax. Dönitz sent 50 U-boats to intercept a series of massive, slow-moving convoys, including ONS-5. He was expecting a slaughter. He got one. It was his own. The battle for convoy ONS-5 was the turning point of the war. The U-boats attacked. This time, the escorts were ready. When a U-boat radioed a contact report, Huff-Duff got its bearing. When the Wolfpack closed in at night, radar-equipped destroyers raced out to meet them. When a U-boat dived, the destroyers and corvettes, now equipped with a new weapon called Hedgehog, which fired contact-fused bombs ahead of the ship, pounced on them. When the B-24s and carrier-based aircraft arrived, they hunted the U-boats relentlessly, forcing them to stay submerged, draining their batteries, making them slow, blind, and helpless. The hunters had become the hunted. The U-boat crews were in a state of shock. They were dying in ways they couldn't understand. They were being seen in total darkness. They were being found in the middle of the ocean. Their Wolfpack tactic was failing. The escorts were now the wolves. The numbers for Black May 1943 are the most stunning of the entire war. In that 1 month, the Allies lost 12 ships. In that same month, the Luftwaffe lost 41 U-boats. 1/4 of Dönitz's entire operational fleet gone in 30 days. The losses were unsustainable. The U-boat force was breaking. On May 24, 1943, a shattered Karl Dönitz sent a message to his fleet. The U-boat arm has been forced to draw the only possible conclusion from the heavy losses. It must, for the present, be withdrawn from the North Atlantic. He had pulled his U-boats out of the fight. The Battle of the Atlantic, the longest, most vital campaign of the war, was over. It had been won. The lifeline was secure. The tonnage war was reversed. The Allies were now building ships far faster than they were losing them. The great highway to Europe was now open, and across that highway for the next 12 months would flow the millions of men, the tens of thousands of tanks, and the mountains of supplies that would be needed for one specific day in June 1944. D-Day. The invasion of Normandy, the liberation of Europe, was only possible because in the dark, freezing, secret-filled waters of the North Atlantic, the Wolfpack had been broken.